Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thank you for joining us for our May webinar today. As you're joining, please make sure that you've got your microphones muted and your cameras turned off. This will just allow everybody to focus on the presenters today. So I am pulling our slides up. My name is Erin Suddeth, and I'm the branch manager for the Title I Part A Support and Improvement branch here at KDE. And this morning we've got two of my colleagues with us, so I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm David Malonte, one of the assistant directors in the division.
Hi, I'm Zach Stumbo. I'm the state homeless coordinator for the McKinney-Vento program.
All right. So as always, if you've got any questions or comments during the webinar, those of you joining us in Teams, you can put those in the chat. You can also email them to me at erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov. And at the end, when we go through questions, if you'd rather come off mute and you're on Teams, you can use the raise hand feature and join us that way. We do always record and post our webinars to the Title I Documents and Resources webpage. So this should be posted probably later today or sometime tomorrow. Be sure to check out last month's webinar if you weren't able to join us. We did a pretty deep dive into a brand new resource from KDE. This is our Title I Part A carryover information document. We talked about just kind of background information and some terms related to carryover, the 15% carryover limitation, how carryover funds can be spent, specifically some of those required reservations, the carryover limitation waiver, and creating a process for monitoring carryover. That creating a process, that is sometimes a finding that we see during monitoring. So if you don't have a process or you don't know what I'm talking about and you missed the webinar, definitely go back and watch that. So for today's agenda, we've just got a couple reminders and announcements. And then for the majority of it, we're going to be focusing on students experiencing homelessness. And that's why we have Zach here with us to provide some additional information and answer any questions that you all might have. A lot of times when you send homeless questions to your assigned Title I consultant, we turn right around and we ask Zach. So he's our expert. Okay, our reminders. First of all, just make sure you are checking the status of any open applications in GMAP. Just making sure that you've addressed any lingering consolidated checklist items. You want to make sure that the status of any open applications is marked KDE consultant approved. And this does include some of the previous years that are still open. It's really easy once you get going on the current year to forget that you've got some other years' applications open as well. And our other reminder is about fiscal year 2021 funds. So that is projects 310G, GM, GN, and GP. Just wanted to remind you that those funds must be obligated by June 30th. And you can get all the information about that on the 2021 award notification, which I've linked on the slide for you. Our statewide federal programs training, we are offering this at no cost to school districts. Once again, this is going to be on June 13th through the 15th. I know many of you joined us for our September training. It's the same kind of setup. So we've got the same content just being offered 3 different days to make sure that you're able to attend. We're going to be back at the Central Bank Center in Lexington, and our training is provided by the Brewman Group. They're formerly Brewstein and Manasavit. That's who did the September training. And they are a legal firm that's nationally recognized for federal grants management, education, regulatory, and legislative practices. So we do really encourage the superintendent, the finance officer, and federal programs coordinator or coordinators of different federal programs to attend. So we are going to re-engage some of the same topics from fall 2021, but we're also going to have some new information based on some things that we have observed during monitoring. So there is going to be new information here. We are applying for both ELA and finance officer PD credit for this training. To register, you're just going to complete this registration form that's linked on the slide. This is going to remain open up until the training dates, but you do want to go ahead and register as soon as possible to make sure that you get your preferred date. We do ask that you register individually for everyone in your district that wants to attend. Once you've registered, go ahead and mark your calendar for your first and second choice of dates, and then we will be communicating with you, confirming your date. And if you indicate that you're interested in a hotel room, we'll also follow up with you individually on that. So if you've already registered and you need to make a change or cancel that, you can contact me or our administrative assistant, Leslie Bridges, and we will help you with that. So as the school year is winding down, we do typically see an increase in personnel as some people retire and others take on new roles and responsibilities. So as these changes are coming up, you want to be sure that your district web apps admin point of contact, your WAPOC, is updating person role manager accordingly. Person role manager is what feeds into that open house website that people can access to see who the contact is for a variety of different programs. So when a new coordinator is added, we want to make sure that they get added to our email distribution list, our newsletter subscriber list, so that way they're getting all of the Title I related information that comes out of KDE. When they're added to Person Role Manager, their assigned consultant also reaches out and offers any sort of support or training. We can set up a one-on-one Teams call and do some training with you if you need. So we've got instructions on the next slide for exactly how your WAPOC can make these changes. I'm not going to read through these. I'm sure they already know how to do it, but just in case, if you want to share these instructions with them. And I do recommend that everybody just go over to Open House and double check and verify that everything on there is correct. Okay. This is a new addition to our monthly webinar slides, and I just wanted to kind of call everybody's attention to the topics that were in the most recent Title I newsletter to be sure that you didn't miss anything. I know you get a lot of emails and sometimes it's easy to overlook something. So in our May newsletter, of course, we had an announcement about that federal programs training I just mentioned. Some things you might want to look at are information on reviewing and revising school parent and family engagement policies and compacts. A lot of people do that this time of year. You should be wrapping up equitable services for private schools. We've got a couple of reminders in there. If you're ever unsure about whether or not something is allowable, reach out to your consultant and they can give you some more information. A reminder about those final FY23 allocations. And we also have something in there about House Bill 32, which was passed just in this year's legislative session, and how that relates to paraeducator requirements. That is the bill that had to do with a high school diploma and employment. So be sure that you check that out. We do release these monthly and then we post them on our webpage. They stay up there for a year. So if you're not currently receiving the newsletter, just let me know and I can add you to the subscriber list. All right, so shifting gears, we're going to take a look at some of the different requirements surrounding children and youth experiencing homelessness. And Zach is going to just jump in and interrupt me whenever he needs to. All right, so like I said, we are focusing on homeless children and youth, specifically that section of the district consolidated monitoring form. We're going to review some of the different requirements, focus on some of the more common findings that we see when we're monitoring, as well as some of the recommendations that we give. So a lot of these topics have been shared in previous webinars and newsletters, but it's been a little while since we last discussed them, so we thought it would be a good idea to revisit. So at first, we're going to begin with the definition of homeless. I know when a lot of us hear the word homeless, or maybe before we got involved in education, when we thought about homeless, we automatically think of someone who is completely unhoused with nowhere to live. But if you look at the slide, you can see that for the purpose of education, the definition is a lot broader than that. So it's important to ensure that school and district staff are more familiar with this expanded definition. So McKinney-Vento says that this refers to individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. And then we've got some examples here for you. So people could be sharing housing with other people because maybe they've lost their housing or they've had some economic hardship, a loss of job or something. A lot of times this is referred to as doubled up or doubling up. This could include people living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, or camping grounds because they lack an alternative accommodation. Of course, people who are living in emergency or transitional shelters for various reasons, abandoned at a hospital. Primary and nighttime residence, it's a public or private place, but it's not designed for or ordinarily used as regular sleeping accommodations for human beings. And then living in cars, parks, public spaces, things like that. I do want to clarify that each living arrangement will need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. So for example, let's say that a family has purchased a new house, but they have to spend a few nights with family or in a hotel before they fully take ownership and move into their new house. That family's not going to be considered homeless, obviously.
Erin?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
You're fine.
One question that has come up routine a few times since I've been in the role is what happens if parents are divorced and one parent is homeless and one is not?
Oh, that's a good question.
And I have reached out to NCHE and I have an answer, and this was in our homeless newsletter, but maybe not everyone here gets or sees that. It is on our website. If one parent meets the eligibility, then the student is McKinney-Vento, just as any other student would be McKinney-Vento until that parent reaches full housing. And then they would be McKinney-Vento for the rest of the year. I'm sure we'll get to that in this presentation. One thing for Title I that would be important is, say that you're going to give the parent gas cards or some kind of separate funding, that is only applicable to the parent that is homeless.
Yeah, that makes
sense.
sense.
I just wanted to point that out really quick.
Yeah, absolutely. See, the districts are learning things, I'm learning things. It's great.
That's a new thing I recently.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, no, you're fine. Another thing you might notice on this slide, we've got the term trailer park, which is another example of a living scenario which would need to be evaluated by the liaison. There could be a number of contributing factors to whether or not that qualifies as homeless, like the age and the upkeep of that trailer. So our first requirement is to have a homeless liaison. Each district must have at least one person assigned the role of homeless liaison. We've also linked this brief from the National Center for Homeless Education, and this is just all about the role of the homeless liaison, some of the different, some insights, some responsibilities that that person has. And the name and contact information for this person must be up to date in open house using those person role manager instructions that we just included on the previous slide. So one of the things that we do when we monitor, before we even show up, we check open house and see who is listed as the homeless liaison. And one of the pieces of documentation that districts provide for us comes from 704 KAR 790. And that is a requirement that all homeless liaisons complete the annual training that's been approved by KDE for the current year. So districts will upload that training certificate for the current year for us. Our next requirement relates to the homeless education posters. So there's a requirement that districts provide public notice of the rights of homeless children and youth. We want those in locations that are frequented by parents and guardians of such youth, as well as unaccompanied youths. So having these posters on display ensures that the appropriate people are seeing this information. There are two different posters. One's got information for parents and another's got information for the school-age youth. And all of those posters are available in English and Spanish. So we want to make sure, like I said, those are posted throughout the district in places where they can be easily seen. So when we're talking about the school buildings, probably the front office, somewhere really prominent. And you might also want to put those posters up throughout the community, maybe grocery stores, shelters, libraries, soup kitchens, places that people frequent. And districts can order up to 10 new posters each year for free from the National Center for Homeless Education, and we've got a link there. And that's really important because sometimes we'll go to districts and we'll see maybe like a photocopy of the poster or just a printed out version that isn't as easy to read. So you might not know that you can get those 10 free posters. You also want to make sure that both the district and the state homeless liaison contact information on the poster is accurate. There's space at the bottom for each contact information. So of course, you'll have your district person's information. And if you go to our homeless education webpage, all of Zach's specific contact information is on there. I want to point out that the NCHE has other free resources available on their webpage, the same place where you get that those posters. They've got brochures, parent packs, things like that. So if you follow the link that's on this slide and then click on products, you can review all of the available resources that they have. And of course, our homeless education webpage has a lot of different resources for you to check out as well, including their newsletter, like Zach said. And of course, we can get you subscribed to that if you aren't.
And they're very inexpensive. The posters are $1, I think, or $1.50. So
yeah,
they're not very expensive. So.
Okay, so next is requirements surrounding awarding credit and diplomas. So KRS 156-160, this was amended during the 2019 legislative session. So these requirements are still relatively new. And of course, we know things changed in 2020. So it's very possible that in all of the confusion with COVID, something got overlooked. So this statute says, to the extent feasible, homeless children and unaccompanied youth should be awarded credit. That includes partial credit for all coursework that they have satisfactorily completed. So districts should have a policy in place stating that this requirement will be met. Many of you probably have the same or very similar sounding policies. Now, within this, it also says that districts must adopt written procedures to ensure credit, again, including partial credit, is awarded for all coursework satisfactorily completed by homeless children and unaccompanied youth. Also says that districts must adopt written procedures for awarding a high school diploma to homeless children and unaccompanied youth who transfer after the completion of the second year of high school and meet the requirements that are outlined in KRS 156, 160, 1MP. So these are on our checklist. These are two separate indicators. However, we've seen a lot of districts choose to just combine these into one procedural document for awarding both credit and diplomas. They go hand in hand. Now, I have bolded the phrase written procedures in both of these just to kind of help differentiate them from the policy. So as a reminder, your policy is like a general goal stating that the district or school will meet a specific requirement. Whereas your procedures outline the individual steps each specific district will take to meet that requirement. So your policy might say something like, the district will award credit, including partial credit, etc. Whereas your procedures are going to say, you know, ABC district will ensure credit is awarded by 1, 2, 3, and then actually outline those steps that take place in your district. So if you imagine a new staff person, like say a guidance counselor comes to your district, they should be able to pick up your written procedures and kind of use them as instructions in awarding credit. So these procedures on here, there are a number of specific details in the procedures for awarding credit that need to be included, and we're gonna take a look at those on the next slide. So this list of required components comes directly from that 704 KAR 790. But I thought it might be a little bit easier to read on our monitoring checklist. So I've just linked that here, and then I've kind of shortened and summarized some of the requirements here just for keeping the slide clear and the sake of time. But this gives you an idea of the type of information that needs to be considered in developing your procedures. So first, we've got the tool or methodology the district uses to calculate credit. A lot of times for partial credit, this includes some sort of formula. Determining how much time was spent and how much credit is awarded accordingly. Any consolidation of partial credit, And there's a lot of different things that the homeless children need to be provided access to, like extracurricular activities, summer programs, any sort of credit transfer or electronic course services, of course, after school tutoring, before school tutoring, other extended school services, and all of these should be provided at no cost to the students. And I've linked 2 resources that we like to share related to these written procedures. These are the NCHE's Maximizing Credit Accrual and High School Completion for Homeless Students, and also Schoolhouse Connections Awarding and Accepting Partial Credits for Students Experiencing Homelessness. Those are both really great resources. The Schoolhouse Connection link will take you to their webpage, and then on that webpage, there's another link to a checklist that they've created that can help you when you're creating these procedures. And remember that just like with any written process or procedures, you want to be reviewing these documents on a regular basis and making sure that you are updating them as needed, that they're reflecting what's actually happening in your district. Yes, Zach.
Hey, Erin, just a couple of thoughts about this. I just want to underscore what you said, that these should be tailored to each district. Nothing that's out there could be universally adopted, in my opinion. And not that that's a statement from KDE, but just my opinion. I don't see that anything could be universally adopted for this. It would have to be tailored for it, and to read carefully through that link on the screen, because some of the things read will or should, and then there's a section that says may, and then there's another part under it that says should again after that. So, or not should, but will. It's a mandatory part after that again. So I think that's where some districts are getting caught up when I do my separate grant monitoring. So I just read that very carefully when you go through there. And also, as far as providing some of those things, homeless students should be given, put to the front of the line if there's a limit to how many people can attend things in the summer and things like that. Sorry to take up time.
No, that's why you're here. And I would agree. I think we talk about that a lot, how these different procedures, there's no one size fits all for most of them. It needs to really reflect what's happening in that district. That's why we don't just have like a template we can just give you to fill in, because we couldn't create something that applies to all 171 districts. Next, we're going to talk about the homeless set-aside funds. So this is in section 1113C of ESSA, and this requires all districts to set aside a reasonable and necessary amount to provide services for homeless children at both Title I and non-Title I schools. These funds need to be used to provide comparable services provided to children in Title I schools. They could be used to remove barriers that prevent regular attendance, or to provide additional support like tutoring, summer school, things like that. They can be used to meet the basic needs of students experiencing homelessness, so that they can fully participate in school. For example, some school supplies, there may be some health-related needs or clothing. And they may be used to provide transportation of a homeless student to that student's school of origin. And a couple of things I want to point out about the set-aside funds that are not on the slide. These funds should be spent during the fiscal year in which they were reserved on the students identified as experiencing homelessness. And just like with all federal expenditures, any expenses need to be reasonable, allocable, and necessary, and addressing documented needs. So when you're determining this set-aside amount, ESSA does not provide us a formula or a percentage or anything. It just says a reasonable and adequate amount. So what we ask is that in GMAP on the district set-aside page, you have a place for the homeless set-aside amount and the narrative. We want you to put that methodology in the narrative. And we have some examples of methodologies from the U.S. Department of Education. So first up is a needs assessment, just in seeing what it is that your families identified as homeless are needing. Some districts like to use a per pupil amount. They may use a specific percentage based on the district's poverty level or the total Title I Part A allocation, or they could look at their historical homeless expenditure data and determine a reasonable amount from that. Or it could be a combination of some of these. You might do a needs assessment and look at your historical expenditure data. Now, once the district has determined the appropriate amount to reserve and that original application gets KDE approval, that amount cannot be decreased. And we talked about that in last month's webinar as well. So funds reserved for homeless students must be used for that purpose. You can go back and increase the amount, but you cannot decrease it. And it's really important that the homeless liaison and the Title I coordinator, if they're not the same person, they really need to be working together to determine an appropriate amount of funds to reserve. And I think one thing to really consider is the fact that we can't go back and decrease this amount. We can always add to it, but we can't decrease it. Right, and then just a couple notes about the use of funds. Of course, we want to make sure that the things that we're purchasing are supplemental. Again, expenditures have to be reasonable, meaning that the cost is something that a reasonable or a prudent person would think is acceptable for that particular service or item. We want to make sure that expenses are allocable, meaning they match the intent of the program, and necessary. They are needed to run the program. We also want to make sure that they're addressing identified needs. So a perfect place to document that would be like on a needs assessment. The funds really should focus on educational programming. I did mention that they can be used for those different welfare needs, but we also want to make sure we're thinking about things like tutoring and counseling, any sort of mental health services beyond just food and clothing and things like that. And I know a lot of districts have community partnerships with churches and things that actually take care of a lot of those more immediate welfare needs. So we've linked NCHE's Serving Students Experiencing Homelessness under Title I Part A. This is just a brief with some examples of allowable uses of funds. And thinking about what type of documentation you should maintain as evidence of compliance. So first, obviously, policies. Next is written processes and procedures, again, like we said a minute ago, that are specific to your district. So when you're looking at these documents or you're developing them, you need to ask yourself, do these documents accurately reflect how things are done in our district, or maybe has something changed and we need to update it? Also, are the appropriate staff familiar with these processes and procedures? Are they able to kind of articulate those during a monitoring interview process? They won't be very effective processes or procedures if nobody knows anything about them. Some more documentation would be evidence of training. So first up, think about the type of training that your homeless liaison attends. We've already talked about the certificate for the annual training approved by KDE, but there's lots of other trainings out there. You could provide proof that someone went to that. And then another aspect of training to think about is, what about training that the homeless liaison provides to other staff? So that type of documentation could be agendas, sign-in sheets, any sort of training materials that they created. And we've just got some example topics of for trainings here. Identification and enrollment, making sure that we're removing those barriers and enrolling students immediately. Of course, the procedures for awarding credit and diplomas, maybe something about trauma-informed care. These are just a couple options of training topics. We've talked about the posters being on display. When we're in the district monitoring, we do check and make sure that the poster is on display, that it's got the correct information, that it's in a location where parents are going to be able to see it. And then any sort of purchase orders, invoices, or receipts. There are kind of some more specifics about homeless spending. So sometimes when we're monitoring and you've submitted your Munis report, we may reach out and ask to see specific purchase orders or some sort of invoice or something, just to make sure that these funds were spent on allowable services and items. And Zach, what do you want to add?
One thing about homeless spending that I think would make things move a little bit easier for all sides. We have new matrices that will be coming forth soon, I believe, that I've helped review with people here at KDE to provide some more information. I always encourage people to keep emails if they've corresponded back and forth with me. That's a great source of documentation. Another thing, we've opened up some new codes, and it'll have references on there that say, speak with the state coordinator or something like that. So of course that needs to be written documentation, keep that email, something to that effect. One thing that's really hard for us when we're looking through that would be if you just write the word supplies. I'm going to have to reach out, or somebody's going to have to reach out and ask you what those supplies are. So if you could just be a little bit more descriptive than that with homeless, we just need to know more than that. That's all.
Yeah, that's true for pretty much all Title I stuff. We can't be too generic. And also, if you wanted to, when you're doing your GMAP application, if there's something that you have talked to Zach about and you want to like make a note of that, even in your budget narrative, here's the thing that we're, getting parentheses discussed with Zach Stumbo, and put a date or something in case you were to need to pull that email or something and provide that as documentation. That just helps you easily locate it. And you could do that for other Title I things, obviously, not just homeless. I
tell them to do that on expense reports too. I say, please just mention, discuss with state coordinator and a date. Thanks.
It gets hard to keep track when you're dealing with a whole bunch of districts of who you've talked about what with and what was said. All right. So do we have any questions? I don't see any in the chat, but let me pull up the email real quick. All right, I am not seeing any in the email, but of course, if you think of one after this, you can email me, you can email Zach. Your assigned consultant will get it to the person it needs to go to. So we've got our upcoming webinar dates. Our next webinar is going to be Thursday, June 29th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, as always. So be sure that you mark your calendar for these upcoming webinars. And I said this when I sent out the PowerPoint, but I do just always like to remind you that we value your feedback and we want to know what you think is helpful, what you'd like to see more of in webinars and newsletters and things like that. So of course you can always send that directly to me or your assigned consultant, but if you'd prefer to do it anonymously, we do have an anonymous webinar feedback survey, and the link to that is always in the Title I newsletter. It's also in the email that I sent with the PowerPoint this morning. Okay, so you've got a question in the chat. When should we plan to receive funding amounts and begin planning in GMAP? I kind of thought this question might come up today. I don't have a specific date at this time, unfortunately, but as soon as we have that date, we will let you know. So for now, just keep, working with that hold harmless amount for your planning. Okay, and I'll do one last email check for questions. And I don't see any. So thank you all for joining us this morning, and we look forward to seeing you in June.